I think a lot of President Trump's strategy has been arrived at accidentally at times also through the extroverted sensing function, but then it's drawn into a very deep analytical well of experience and strategic depth that we never see because it's introverted.
To the curious, the seekers, and to the experts, welcome. You're listening to Poli-Psych podcast. We decided, since we enjoyed our presentation of the presidents' Enneagram types, the founding fathers, not all presidents, that we would take a look at some of the presidents in the past who share Donald Trump's MBTI type, which is ESTP. So today we are going to be examining those presidents. Among them are Theodore Roosevelt, James Buchanan, and Andrew Jackson, and of course, our present President, Donald Trump. With me to discuss these presidents are Don. Hey, Don.
Hello, Cindy and Ken. Don, am an INTJ and Enneagram Type 5, social subtype.
And Ken. Hello, Ken.
Hi, Cindy. INTJ and Enneagram 9, and I forgot my wing. That's not my, I'm not as up to verse on the Enneagram.
I'm not sure you have a wing.
Yeah. Some people, I'm pretty much even on my 5. I have both of. I can recognize in myself some 4-ish characteristics as well as 6-ish characteristics. But the main discriminator for me from other 5s is the social subtype, because most 5s are either self-pres or one-on-one. So the social subtype makes a big difference for a 5. So.
Mm-hmm. And Cindy, what yours? Let's see. Let me guess. INFJ.
Yes, I'm an INFJ, and I am a 2, and I do have a wing. I'm a 1 wing. I tend toward being a tiny bit OCD, and I have a pretty strong J. I like to finish things. I like to get things done and move on. And so that, I think that pushes me a little over onto the one side of 2.
Great. Let's start. Since we're doing a show that's based upon every president being an ESTP, I'll just anchor and do a little technical gloss on what that means from the angle of behavioral psychology. And we have a variety of names attached to this type, but the one I like the most is one that I actually use quite a bit for visualizing purposes, and it's the class clown. And we all know, we can all picture a class clown, and especially the male class clown. My friend Phil, who I've known since he was about 8 or 9, was always right at the event horizon, and had great facility with verbal skills, and always had the wisecrack at just the perfect time. Timing was excellent, but he also had a very deep, thoughtful side that you didn't see. And from a technical angle, we've got then extroverted sensing being the strongest go-to function for the ESTP. The secondary function in Jung's conception, especially brilliantly, is introverted, and it's there operating under the surface due to the fact that it's very difficult for humans to operate two perceiving functions at the same time in extroverted fashion. So the human psyche is designed to be very facile at one or the other, depending upon the group, the diversity of other types to kind of round that out in a social context. We're social animals. So the function of the ESTP is to be on that event horizon, and they aren't always as good at thinking right on their feet immediately. They usually need to go, it's like any introvert would. An introverted thinker is especially good at focusing on a certain topic and delving into it in great depth. Extroverted thinker is a little better with brainstorming. They're a little more cooperative in a social problem-solving context. The introverted thinker is not that way. You will not see their strategy. they have a great tolerance for chaos in the world of phenomenology, the sensing world, and it's underlaid by a very deep strategic concept that they're quite comfortable in hiding, and also quite comfortable in delaying with long rollout of time, knowing that there's an inevitable introverted finality to the strategy. That, and again, the P on the end there, it's a perceiving type, indicating that President Trump's and any ESTP's, in theory, perceiving function is the one that they show to the world. And it also means that they're not pushing for the J or the judging function to achieve finality or to have matters settled. And this is what drives a lot of people crazy about President Trump, is that he is not necessarily ready to make up his mind right away. He's waiting for new information. He's completely comfortable with chaos everywhere and a deep underlying strategy, but not necessarily always 100% constructive in the classical sense.
Well, and that makes perfect sense in the strategic world. You remind me of the Sun Tzu quote: "Don't interrupt your enemy while he's destroying himself." So a lot of Jays would want to jump in there and claim victory at the point where President Trump is absolutely silent. He doesn't want to really come off as gloating. Sometimes he does, but that doesn't always really help matters. More often, he'll just back off. And many people, like you say, don't understand or appreciate that. They want him to be more aggressive, but sometimes it's just not wise strategy.
Right. I'd say the extrovert, the official Jungian definition of extrovert is sufficient contact with many objects. And we will see President Trump sometimes impulsively commenting maybe before the introverted thinking function has really kicked in, yet he is comfortable with that as well. And I would say that people misinterpret that. And I think a lot of President Trump's strategy has been arrived at accidentally at times, also through the extroverted sensing function, but then it's drawn into a very deep analytical well of experience and strategic depth that we never see because it's introverted. So most introverted feeler is the same way. Extroverted feeler, you're going to know, you're going to tell by their facial expressions exactly how they feel. Introverted feeler, poker face.
He did have, I think, shed a few tears during Battle Hymn of the Republic on the 4th of July at the gala in Washington, D.C. So that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, and thanks for bringing that up, because it does underlie another theoretical, his tertiary or third function is theoretically extroverted feeling. So President Trump will be able to express feelings directed towards either harmony, or at least in harmony with group values, and that's really shines during the rallies, and it makes him a better speaker. And I think in those situations he is sort of taking the introverted thinking function out of play. But you do see the introverted thinking function come up in situations where he's doing a quiet presentation, maybe signing like the healthcare activity yesterday, the executive order on dialysis and some other issues.
I think that that may be partly because he is a heart type, as an Enneagram 3, as we believe he is. He's a heart type, so even though the 3 tends to kind of suppress their center as the feeling type, it's definitely there when you see him, as you said, when you see him interact with people, and in certain circumstances, I think that's one reason why he connects so well with people. He is a heart type.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll just take this opportunity to point out that all of the 4 that we're going to look at today, all of the 4 presidents, are on that triangle part of the Enneagram, and meaning that they're in the center of the mind, will, or the emotions, whichever of the 3 quadrants that they're in. So each of those types will tend to suppress their feelings, or suppress their thoughts, or suppress their will Now, I have to back up and say, actually, Andrew Jackson would be not in the center because he's not a 9, I don't believe, but and that we'll get into that a little bit more detail later. But that is a characteristic of the suppression of the primary quadrant energy is a common feature in a lot of presidents, and ones today, yes, except for Andrew Jackson, probably.
That said, do you want to go back to, we could take it from the earlier ESTP presidents and move forward in history?
Yeah, I'm actually really comfortable in discussing Andrew Jackson because I did, within the last couple of years, read a book about him called the Andrew Jackson, His Life and Times by a man named Brand, H.W. Brands, and it was quite well written. It wasn't as popular as another book that was currently being featured by a perhaps more well-known author, something about the lion or something. I forget who had lion in the title. Andrew Jackson Lion, something like that. But this one by Brands was kind of a standard, and I got a real feel for the guy. And I came out, having studied the Enneagram, having an idea of personality, I almost always approach whenever I learn about somebody through an Enneagram lens. And it was pretty clear to me that Andrew Jackson is a 1. Ones have an anger, have a temper. Andrew Jackson is very well known for his many duels and his confrontational nature. So that is a 1-ish characteristic. He knew that something was worth fighting for, and he did it. His constitution being kind of wiry in frame and known as Old Hickory, he had some physical issues, but he soldiered through them, and his endurance was famous. There was no stopping him once he set his mind to something, all very 1-like characteristics. And this is a man that basically fought against the first central bank in the United States and was victorious over it. And that was his... Many people say that that's on his tombstone. Actually, I don't think it is, that he defeated the bank. But it's one of his lifelong achievements that he was most proud of. And that's because he believed that was wrong, that it was a subjugation of the American people to the European monetary system. And he set his entire energy against that. And of course, he was a wartime general, and in the Battle of War of 1812, and significant battles in that war. He is also probably single-handedly the most important person in securing the state of Florida as one of the new states to be added to the Union. Very successful military campaigns there. Of course, he's known very, very unsympathetically by the American Indian population as being a very ruthless warrior against the Indian nation. So the Native Americans don't like Jackson one bit, and that's, I think, why President Trump probably backed off in really saying too many positive things about Andrew Jackson, because that was in the period of American history where, in order to be a general and a military man, you had to fight successful wars against the Native Americans. And of course, Andrew Jackson also did own slaves. And during his lifetime, by the time he became president, slavery was becoming increasingly unpopular, and especially to having sold or traded slaves was actually beginning to be considered in a different category than being simply a slaveholder of generationally held slaves. And Andrew Jackson made the distinction that he did very little in the way of acquiring or trading slaves, but tried to care well for those that he did have. And all of these value judgment type of things really speaks to the ethical nature of Andrew Jackson, which is a prominent feature of ones. And I know that Cindy having a one wing herself, has some strong ideas about ones and how they relate to the world. She might have a thing or two to add about Andrew Jackson as a one.
Well, one thing that I would first like to make note of is that we do know that President Trump has been inspired by Andrew Jackson, and I can't help but wonder if he kind of keyed off Andrew Jackson for his hairstyle. I was surprised going through some of these images of Andrew Jackson. He had, his hair was kind of unruly, but yeah, the thing about ones is, and quite honestly, I'm not all that comfortable with ones. I find ones, even though I have a one wing, I find ones to be some of the more difficult people to get along with, because the tendency is to they have such high standards that they set for themselves, that they tend to impose very high standards on the people around them, which causes them to come off as rather judgmental. And of course, I don't know anything about that pertaining to Andrew Jackson, but again, they have very high standards, and they are very free with requiring others to live up to their standards.
Well, along those lines, I want to ask Ken why he thinks that Andrew Jackson was a P and not a J.
That's an interesting question. I haven't thought of that, but I will think on my feet here and say that he does have the J function. It's the introverted thinking function is a judging function. So it's hard to see it, but in some situations, if you're forced into, for instance, especially in the military, you will need to exercise that muscle a lot. And he was by the standards of the day, this President Jackson was a military Superman. And he literally was regarded as the second Napoleon of that time, the Battle of New Orleans. So he was able to develop that introverted thinking function, a very balanced intellect. And he also faced a lot of challenges along the way. But I believe he lost both parents during the Revolutionary War era. He lost his brother. I think he was the only surviving member of his nuclear family.
Yes.
And forced just a horrific horrifically challenging military series of military challenges, especially with the later territorial disputes with Native American population. And he was forced to make very difficult decisions based upon the values of that time, which are now very dissonant when you look back. But good question. I think he's still a perceiving type. Again, because of the fact that his sensing function is really what drives him to succeed in the end. The act of being in an active battle requires that vigilance and that attention to the broader landscape as opposed to the focused landscape of the farmer or someone who's an introverted sensor, where you're just focusing on one thing and you're kind of screening everything else out so you can keep your focus.
Yeah, I agree with what you've said there about the perceiving function in Jackson as a military man, very much so. In fact, I'll take that to the next level, and it even functions while he's president, because reading through Jackson's biography, one of the guiding touchstones of his life is an entire value system. The value system being absolutely key for a one is his belief in the importance of preserving the Union, and that was his paramount value, is the importance of the United States not becoming divided into factions and states not competing with one another to the point that it was detrimental, but that the unity of the nation would be preserved, the United States. And that was always very much a focus, and he was always cognizant of how the enemy played divide and conquer. So, of course, that belief, that value would prevent him from himself becoming factionalized and taking this side or that. He would always look for the greater good to come out for everyone involved. And whether it's a military campaign or a political campaign, that was always his focus. And of course, that is what the perceiving function does is it wants to take everything into consideration. Of course, Jackson, being a 1, would have a 9 wing, which is very much has the ability to see all sides. And some ones become more task-oriented or single-minded towards their goal. Focus is a famous 1 characteristic, but Jackson, the overall theme is the United States as a whole.
Yeah, and I'd say it was a little bit different. We can contrast it with President Trump. His election was probably regarded as somewhat inevitable. He was very well known for his war record, and I believe from the
but it was inevitable, but it also wasn't in a sense, because people had the reaction to Jackson. My goodness, if Andrew Jackson can become president, anybody can become president. He was born a poor orphan and made it all the way to the highest office in the land. So with Jackson, the New England aristocracy, or even Virginia plantation owner aristocracy that had held sway over the presidency, was broken in Jackson.
That's true. Yes, he is now, in hindsight, regarded as the first populist, and I think it was actually Virginia that did predominate, but that was the dominant dichotomy, was between the Boston and old Puritan elements, and then the further south of Williamsburg concentration of that initial settlement that eventually blossomed into the state of Virginia being a very powerful entity. And I believe we had John Adams, of course, but Virginia did dominate the political landscape. And the interesting part about, just a few other points about his time in office and before and after, he did face a secession crisis with South Carolina and faced off against, I believe it was Henry Clay. Henry Clay persisted as a historical influence well into the Civil War era. And so South Carolina again became the epicenter of secession as a precursor to the Civil War, what we now call the Civil War. And it's, again, we have a sea change, a president who comes on board. We have the populist element that you alluded to, Don. But you've also got the phrase that we could call, today we call it the deep state. And in their terminology, they called it something to the effect, to the victor go the spoils. And what that meant was that all the interested parties that were serving either postmaster or anything on up to the cabinet positions all faced an existential employment crisis, essentially. And this new sea change president, who wasn't part of the established order, came in and swept all that away.
Yes, correct. And that's the first time that had happened in American history.
Yeah, and he also did pay down the national debt. It was a much smaller number at that time, but he did have that thrift orientation, likely from facing many years of hardship and many years of toil to develop the wealth that he had. So he did bring that influence in. And certainly the military, we're going to remember the Native American removal, but those were horrific conflicts. There were massacres on both sides, and it was definitely a challenge to the just establishing a civil society. And it's sad to see that we had to do it with actually through the process of what we would now call ethnic cleansing. But it was a very brutal process, and he didn't shrink from dealing with it. And we do see now a new perspective on that, but they didn't see it at that time.
Yeah, and you mentioned Henry Clay and the rivalry with Henry Clay, and I don't remember the details other than the fact that almost all of these rivalries or political enemies that Andrew Jackson had, and Henry Clay included, were because from his point of view, Jackson believed he saw a bigger picture, and if somebody was not able to fit in with that bigger picture, namely the United States as a whole, then Jackson would oppose them because he saw them as not being able to come together for the greater good.
Are we ready to move on to our next president?
James Buchanan. He's not a name that comes to mind after this long, but it is an interesting time period in American history where, again, he was the last president before the onset of the Civil War. It consumed most of Abraham Lincoln's attention during his tenure. And ESTP, again, he had a little bit different. I think his perceiving function came out much stronger in his case. He was a career politician, and 15th president. He was aligned with Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party, and that sort of paved the way for his progression through and into the White House. He did try to play both sides of the slavery issue, probably to the detriment of his reputation in history. He supported the Dred Scott decision, and also interestingly indicated that he would not seek a second term. He typecast himself as a one-term president, and he also set out the goals of his administration, and he did achieve them. And I believe they were mostly dedicated to economic issues, and also what he thought was the final settlement of the slavery issue, which didn't really happen. But he thought they had that sort of nipped in the bud with the decision of the Supreme Court regarding the fugitive slave law, which we now regard as a positive evil, and let's call that a negative evil, wherein you did have the imprisonment of African Americans who actually had achieved freedom technically, but you had bounty hunters crossing borders, and I believe Bleeding Kansas took place during his administration. He was president from 1857 through 1861. That would be the John Brown attack on the armory. Mostly, there's very little known about him, mostly because of his attenuated popularity. But in the reports that we get, he did stick to his guns on his issues, and he did attempt to be primarily a mediator. And he was very again, like the perceiving sensing types, he was very comfortable with the chaos that was surrounding him, and probably not as good at really tying loose ends as much as just sort of letting the process move along and take its course.
Yeah, I learned some interesting things in studying up on James Buchanan that I didn't know before, because he is one of the lesser known presidents. And I saw basically what I saw in reading over some highlights of his life was what I'll call a phobic 6 script. Now, in the Enneagram, the type 6 is, unlike all of the other types, very clearly divisible into phobic and counterphobic 6s. And James Buchanan is basically the way I read it, a party animal, and one that's able to, as Ken said, be comfortable with a lot of chaos. They try to position all sides around them and kind of steer the ground towards the middle. They don't really aggressively take stands against one thing or another, and that probably worked to his disadvantage. I'll point out that even though he saw himself as an economic, he wanted to provide some economic solutions to, what probably undid his legacy, at least, or maybe as much as the slavery issue, was the Panic of 1847, I believe it is, somewhere around there, in which he didn't come off so well. He tried to find solutions to a banking crisis, and that was probably the European banking houses fomenting that and trying to get in there and begin another central bank, tried to implement some financial solutions. And even though Buchanan was very much a Jackson man, by the time that he became president of the Democrat Party that he helped to form and found had become its own bureaucracy and had its own, the weight of that bureaucracy to maintain, and that made it difficult for him to navigate those waters. He thought that he could solve the slavery issue by taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but there are points in history where you have to come down on one side or the other. And as a counterphobic six, he wants to try to steer clear of controversy. He wants to take the what appears to be the safer route, and then not the bold and pioneering route. So that probably worked to his disadvantage, and in contrast to another sixth president that we're going to look at shortly. And yeah, that. So, Cindy, do you have any thoughts about counterphobic sixes and/or Buchanan?
Well, I do have thoughts about counterphobic sixes because I happen to have a son.
I meant to say phobic sixes.
Okay. No, I honestly, when you shared some things with me that you read about Buchanan, and even though Barack Obama was probably a 9, there were some mild similarities that I noticed. Just some character, it's just some things that are very much on the periphery, or at least seem to be. But I did wonder about him kind of ostensibly seeking to heal divisions, which kind of can tend to allow for divisions to deepen. And we've seen that with Barack Obama. And I had to wonder when you shared with me some of the things that you read about Buchanan.
Well, let's just go out and say that he's the only president who was a bachelor, who never married, and also he had a companion, and it was widely rumored that this was a gay companion.
Okay. I was trying so hard to be subtle, but I do wonder about it, that time period too. And we know that history tends to repeat itself, and we know, looking back, what happened with the Civil War, and how sometimes trying to put a Band-Aid on division can actually serve to deepen it and make people dig in more. And that's, that is an interesting contrast with President Trump, because he's not afraid to, while he does want unity, I believe with all my heart he does, he's not afraid to single out people who do not fit with what he believes is the best thing for America. And I'm specifically thinking about the press, but there are other groups as well that he is not afraid to point out people who he believes are not serving the American people well. And so, again, when you try to cover up, sometimes that actually contributes more to division than when you just put something right out in the middle of the table. And right now I'm thinking about playing poker, which we know the president does. There are things that he's very subtle about, but very often he will just put something right in the middle of the table for everybody to deal with.
I think another interesting thing would be the similarity with Jackson. They no doubt cooperated, and we already had James Buchanan in Congress at that time during Jackson's administration. So I think the synergy of ESTPs, they would have had a similar approach and probably had some very interesting and lively discussions about people they thought weren't quite up to the task at hand, similar to what we see in some of our president's tweets, especially lately. And I think that might have been underestimated by history, was the echo effect of Jackson. This might really be sort of a Jackson Jr., certainly from the MBTI end of it. And I don't know, Don, is there any similarity? What's the contrasting personality interplay between Jackson and Buchanan from the Enneagram?
Yeah, I don't. I guess I see more differences than similarities. Although, in Buchanan, I basically see a party man. In Jackson, I see somebody who's forging new territory, is breaking new ground. So, although they were both Democrats, and Buchanan definitely adhered to Jackson's philosophy. He was very big into manifest destiny, and a lot of new land was acquired, including the Oregon Territory and Utah also, I believe, during his presidency. He would, and he was very interested, Buchanan was, in taking Cuba as part of the United States. So he had that military conquest Western orientation that Andrew Jackson had, a certain boldness as it regards to America, but he was more of a tried to be a unifier by pulling the different factions together, rather than not caring what other people thought of him.
Well, shall we move on to TR, Teddy Roosevelt?
Yeehaw.
Yes,
and he assumed office in March 1901 after President McKinley's assassination. He was the vice president at that time, and prior to this had difficulties in childhood with asthma, I believe, debilitating asthma. And he did show early on an ability to respond to these challenges pretty deftly, and he became a fairly good athlete and rider and a whole host of other things. And he actually did quite well in the military before the war, or before his tenure in office, and had established that same, not quite on the same level as Jackson, but he did have that ability to communicate extemporaneously without need for extensive notes. And there are stories about his speeches going on for hours, able to hold a crowd, and also speaking almost completely extemporaneously. We don't have any real record of this since movies hadn't quite come into play, but there are some existing clips of him, I believe without audio, but you can see the energy that actually even exceeds President Trump's at times in the way he would, his mannerisms and so on. His ability to connect with the audience was notoriously sharp and popular, and he thrived on that. He thrived on the railroad stops during campaigns and was just a tireless campaigner.
And of course, Teddy Roosevelt is very famous for his trust busting, and the large corporations after World War II, as Abraham Lincoln warned, were becoming very, very powerful and actually needed to be busted up. And even though he came from an aristocratic family, Teddy Roosevelt was up to the task of breaking apart these corporate trusts, and that was important so that the monopolies didn't gain total control of America. And we're at a very similar point today. Again, we're experiencing an echo of history. And if memory serves, President Trump had a grandchild that the parents named Teddy shortly after or slightly before the time he took office. And I'm sure that President Trump is an admirer of Teddy Roosevelt.
I see
Teddy Roosevelt as a counterphobic six. In other words, coming from aristocratic background, he actually took the side of the underdog and fought against the big money interest. So that is something that is a very typical counterphobic six position. And the fact that he was, the script of him as a Rough Rider and the bold persona, that's something that's shared between counterphobic sixes and eights, to the point that those two are often considered lookalike types. And the counterphobic six would be actually more characterized by their opposition to something rather than their advancing boldly towards something. So he's a fighter, and he's a fighter not just because he wants to, take the side of the underdog. He's a fighter for those that are alongside him, and is very much a person that wants to serve as a unifier. He was at the time when America needed a new political party, he started the Bull Moose Party and forged new territory that way. And this is in contrast to Buchanan, who was on the tail end of the new Jacksonian Democratic Party, but it was trying to hold something old together. Teddy Roosevelt is doing something new and birthing a new populist movement that was really necessary at the time to fight the corporations and to fight the established political interests. So, yeah, pretty exciting man, Teddy Roosevelt, and a very much I believe, a counterphobic six. The whole health issues as a young child would also indicate that he was, struggling against something. That's part of this counterphobic six script, is that, you've got something to overcome and you set your entire will against it in order to do so.
Yeah, and I'd say he occupied a similar place in history as Jackson, coming in to an era, the Gilded Age, and a succession of, as some historians refer to them as, sort of bearded nobodies. It's a little bit pejorative, but Grant was very good in the Civil War, very steady, but his administration was beset with some problems, and we had Harrison and Grover Cleveland, and then somebody else, and I think we had Grover Cleveland again. So there was just sort of this complacent Gilded Age, as in the elites were doing pretty well on their side. They were kind of gilding over some of the discontent of the farmers. We had during that time the silver versus gold conflict going on. So populism was becoming recognized as a movement, and I believe they were actually using the word. But Don, what do you make of his? I know Teddy is remembered for speak softly and carry a big stick. How does that fit into what you were saying about?
Right. Well, yeah, the counterphobic six, that fits in because the big stick is, I've got all of my resources ready to do whatever I need to do to take on this bigger thing that that I'm opposing myself to. But I don't want to have to do that, because as a six, I want to be a part of a big coalition. I don't want to have to take this bold action, but I'm ready to do it. I'm not recklessly bold, but I'll be bold if I need to be.
And I'd say too, we know about the big stick, and that's the activity, the battle, the actual conflict itself. But the speak softly part, I see that coming first, and that to me is the introverted thinking portion, and we see that in President Trump. And I'd say Teddy is still remembered as a game changer. We had if you look again at the Gilded Age and you look at the developments in Europe, we had European monarchy. We had the Victorian era in England, and it was a time of basic stability. I'd say from Civil War, of course, was very chaotic, but the U.S. finally achieved most territorial goals during that time. The expansion to the West Coast and the expansion of the railroads, and the U.S. ascended to power on the world stage during this time. And Teddy Roosevelt rose to the occasion, maybe in ways that we could criticize, but he did adopt a foreign policy that was somewhat active in other countries in South America. And I'd say during his tenure, the U.S. really did ascend to the world stage in a way that is with us today, as a almost unipolar world power, and then several times backing away from that when events dictated. But we finally achieved that, that sort of industrial solidity that we still see. We still see the structures, the bridges in New York, and some of the other public works that were begun during that era.
So he made America great.
Well, he did. He had probably different words for it, but it's the same spirit. It almost, the two of them, all four of them, really. We don't have as much of a handle on Buchanan, but if we, not to discount him as a human being, but if we look at even the timestamp is interesting. Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, and now President Trump. There's quite a gap between Teddy Roosevelt and President Trump, but maybe the American public can't handle an ESTP for more than every 3 generations or so, but it does happen where the world turns upside down. And I'd say that history itself is really a lot like life in that it's like driving a car using the rearview mirror, and you still have to look forward to where you're going, but you can't do both at the same time. So we're getting the perspective on what happened with these ESTPs because they're barreling forward. And we don't know. I think we are headed in a direction now that is uncertain. It's probably good, but we don't know what it is. So we're kind of in that zone again, and it's a very exciting time to be doing this work of trying to get a grasp on it. One closing thought on TR, he made a classic mistake. He was so enamored or so happy to be elected for that second term because I think he probably didn't feel like he achieved the first term in a way that awarded him as an individual. He just happened to be vice president at that time when this tragedy struck. And I think during his acceptance speech said he would only run for 1 term. And that proved to be a problem because at that time there were no term limits, and it made him a lame duck president, and it caused other political problems since he wasn't running for re-election or had indicated that he would not. And he ended up splitting off at that point. I believe, Don, I think you had a handle on this about the Bull Moose Party. That was really a reaction to backing away from the prior commitment to not run, which I believe they held him to that in the Republican Party. So point is that he broke away. He was a maverick. I think all 3 of these, at least the main line, Buchanan, I would put in terms, almost calling him Jackson Jr. But all of them were not herd animals at all. They were very capable of adopting a individualistic or novel, ahead of the event horizon solution to whatever was presented to them as a challenge.
Yeah, Buchanan's was not as obvious because his solution was to grab a bunch of things from every conceivable position and try to make them work together, which didn't end up being successful. So that is a difference from the other 3, in which you see more of a breakaway mentality. But you could consider Buchanan Jackson Jr. He was very much in that tradition, but the time in history caused a different outcome.
Well, he certainly didn't settle matters because the secession of South Carolina occurred technically under his administration, even though Lincoln had been elected already, so that was happening. But Buchanan didn't really seek to really solve that problem, and who knows what would have solved it, but it really needed to be addressed in a more assertive way by someone. And this problem had festered for so long, and it just got to the boiling point during his administration.
Yeah, and he avoided it when he could have confronted it. Like, for instance, of course the Lincoln-Douglas debates were famous because you had the 2 very articulate people from both parties were contrasting their views, and Douglas was, of course, the champion of the Jacksonian Democrats, but oddly enough, Buchanan did not endorse during the period of his administration any of the those that were associated with Douglas. So he kind of avoided playing his strengths to his disadvantage.
I think it's very helpful to consider these people. I don't really have a feel for James Buchanan, but Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt were certainly people who were game changers in the generations in which they lived. And I suppose James Buchanan was. We probably don't see him in a light that's as positive because the Civil War came right after his tenure, and of course that's a devastating history for most Americans who have looked at it. But yeah, these other three, they do change things. They're mavericks and they're game changers. So we'll have to see how all this plays out and hopefully President Trump will be as successful as Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt were. And I'm thinking Andrew Jackson was able to get the banks under control, and Theodore Roosevelt is, kind of, to put it simply, made America great. And wow, if President Trump could do both of those things, we would be in the fabled catbird seat.
Well, I think it's worth pointing out explicitly that the whole trust busting thing that Roosevelt accomplished with the railroads and the oil companies and all of that, those corporations that were beginning to be very powerful monopolies, it is a direct relationship, direct precursor to what President Trump is experiencing and right now today confronting the tech giants, the Google, all of the new media, and yet we have at the same time this bright opportunity of the new media using a lot of the same vehicles, but in a very different way. So if it weren't for Teddy Roosevelt, we would have been very much under the control of these corporations that would cause us to live in the world they created. And but yet we had competition enter in, and American entrepreneurship go to new heights of following Teddy Roosevelt, and hopefully that will happen under President Donald Trump as well, because this is a man that understands business and wants America as a whole to prosper.
Dear curious seekers and experts, we thank you for joining us for this examination of the ESTP United States Presidents. We hope that you have enjoyed this time as much as we have, and if you have, we invite you to click like for this video, subscribe to our channel, and share on social media. Until next time, take care.